Today's sermon topic is actually one of my least favorite because I enjoy talking about Jesus Christ. But today, I need to talk about someone called the Antichrist. And the Antichrist will stand opposed to Jesus Christ in every single way imaginable. He will also be kind of a counterfeit Christ who will deceive masses of people and wreak havoc on this world. And so to talk about the Antichrist is really to talk about this wave of evil that will be coming, the likes of which really the world has never seen before. And so this is just kind of a heavy, terrible topic, as you're about to find out. Now, at the same time, talking about the Antichrist and the end times is very important because it is the motivation we need to understand God's prophetic time clock and that it's still ticking. And that clock seems to be winding down, does it not? In fact, it is the opinion of many Bible scholars and prophecy teachers that the return of Jesus for his church is imminent. In other words, the rapture could occur at any time because there is really nothing more in Bible prophecy that needs to happen before Christ's followers are raptured from this earth into heaven. And just to be clear, the word rapture means to be carried off or snatched away. And so the rapture of the church is the event in which God carries away all believers from the earth before God's final judgment when his wrath is poured out on the earth. Now, the doctrine of the rapture was not explicitly taught in the Old Testament, which is why in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul calls it a mystery now revealed. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 51 through 52, he said, "Listen, I tell you a mystery. We will not all sleep, but we will all be changed in a flash, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed." And I really like how the New Living Translation puts verse 51. It says, "But let me reveal to you a wonderful secret. We will not all die, but we will all be transformed." And so, raptured Christians will never experience the sting of death. They will go from here to there in the twinkling of an eye, the Bible says. Now, there is debate, honestly, among Christians about the timing of this event. You know, I happen to believe in something called the pre-tribulation rapture. The pre-tribulation rapture. And I really want you to understand what this means. And so I want to break down this term, pre-tribulation rapture. First, pre means prior to or beforehand. That's what pre means. The next, tribulation means great trouble or suffering. And the tribulation in the Bible refers to a coming period of 7 years of severe trials, suffering, and judgment. And so during this predicted tribulation time, there's going to be severe natural disasters, wars, death, and suffering to a degree that the world has never, ever seen before. It is also during this terrible time that the Antichrist will rise to power. And then lastly, we have that word rapture, which again is when Christ followers will be carried away from this world or snatched away. And so a pre-tribulation rapture simply means that Christians will be taken out of this world before that terrible 7-year tribulation time begins. And I believe in a pre-tribulation rapture for a variety of reasons. And before this series on Daniel concludes, I hope to give you some of those reasons. But today, we are going to focus on the person the Bible refers to as the Antichrist. Now, unfortunately, the Antichrist is one of those topics that has been sensationalized. Would you not agree? You know, in my lifetime, I can't tell you how many times I've heard people speculate about, how so-and-so, they're the Antichrist. And I guess this has been going on even before my lifetime. I read this week that candidates for the Antichrist included Napoleon, Adolf Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin, and in more recent times, people have speculated that John F. Kennedy could have been the Antichrist, or maybe Henry Kissinger because he was, this kind of skilled politician, and so he must be the Antichrist. Others said that it was former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, saying that birthmark on his forehead had something to do with the mark of the beast. Even President Ronald Wilson Reagan was pointed to because his first, middle, and last name were all made up of 6 letters, which of course equals 666. Check out this headline about President Obama. This was in the Guardian. It got kind of cut off there, but it basically says that 1 in 4 Americans think that Obama may be the Antichrist, and that was back when he was president. Now, how many of you heard that former President Bill Clinton could be the Antichrist? Yeah. Some said that Hillary was even the false prophet that's named in the book of Revelation. Verdict's still out on that one. We don't know. But that is a joke, I promise you. Okay, so check out this article from CBN. This is the Christian Broadcasting Network. It says, it asks, what do Donald Trump, Elon Musk, King Charles III, and Emmanuel Macron, who is the president of France, all have in common? Well, then the article answers the question. It reports they are the most frequently cited candidates in recent online searches about the identity of the Antichrist. So I just want to quickly say that we, us Christians in this room, should never participate in this kind of silliness. This is kind of nonsense, is it not? Just because a worldly leader has some characteristics that you may not like or a lot of charisma, that does not mean that person is the Antichrist. And so we got to be careful not to just jump to these crazy conclusions. Okay, so today we continue in the book of Daniel, and last week we covered Daniel chapter 6, which contains one of the most familiar stories in the entire Bible, Daniel in the lion's den. Well, now we've reached the halfway point in the book of Daniel, and today you are going to notice that this book of Daniel pivots in a major way, because the first 6 chapters tell the story of Daniel's life and ministry. It is mainly history, but here in chapter 7, there is this major shift from the historic to the prophetic. Chapters 7 through 12 is what some people call Daniel's prophetic journal. And so the last 6 chapters are Daniel's dreams and visions that describe what the future will hold. Now, there is a lot in Daniel 7 that we could focus on, but I've decided to make today more of an introduction. And so the only figure I'm going to focus on today is that person called the Antichrist, who is mentioned here in Daniel 7. Now, because there is so much prophetic content in the book of Daniel, this book is sometimes called the Bible's little book of Revelation. And it's called that because just like the book of Revelation, the book of Daniel is filled with prophecy. In fact, the book of Daniel mirrors the book of Revelation. The prophetic visions in Daniel support or repeat many of the prophetic revelations that are in Revelation. Now, personally, I find that many prophetic passages in the Bible, I find them to be challenging because prophetic visions are often shrouded in imagery and symbolism and some mystery. On Easter, I covered several of the Old Testament prophecies that were fulfilled by Jesus. But until they were fulfilled by Jesus, those prophecies were often misunderstood and misinterpreted. They say that hindsight is 20/20, and that is very true because until Jesus fulfilled those Old Testament prophecies, they were not fully understood even by many of Jesus's closest followers. And for that reason, I try not to be dogmatic about prophecy because there are Christians who I respect very, very much who have different interpretations of prophetic passages. And I can, kind of agree to disagree with those people that I think are wrong because for the most part, these interpretations are what we would call secondary issues. In other words, if we can agree on the gospel of Jesus Christ and the core teachings of the Bible, I can live with some disagreements on matters that require interpretation, can't you? I agree with the statement that says, in essentials, unity, in non-essentials, liberty, and in all things, love. Okay, so again, everything in the second half of Daniel is prophetic. And so this is part of what makes the Bible such an amazing book because, what other book can accurately describe future events? And of course, these events that Daniel records are very intense, as I have mentioned. In fact, they are so intense that Daniel is affected by them physically. Daniel gets physically ill when he has these visions. In chapter 8, verse 27, he says, "Then I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for several days. Afterward, I got up and performed my duties for the king, but I was greatly troubled by the vision and could not understand it." And so these visions were so overwhelming that they made Daniel, feel faint and become physically sick. So this really is some intense stuff. And the reason these visions are so intense is because Daniel's visions describe a new world order that is coming. And part of this new world order there will be the Antichrist will arise. And even now, I think many Bible scholars and prophecy teachers speculate that this Antichrist, just based on the timing of things, could very well be on this planet right now, kind of waiting in the political wing somewhere out there. Many Christians believe this Antichrist has at least been born. But again, we don't know who he is. But one thing is for sure. The Antichrist will be a real person who is coming, and he will be possessed or controlled by the spirit of Satan. And at some point, he will appear front and center on the world stage and become a world dictator. This is what Daniel gives us a glimpse of. And then the book of Revelation confirms Daniel's account. Okay, so let's read from Daniel chapter 7, verses 1 through 3. It says, "Earlier, during the first year of King Belshazzar's reign in Babylon, Daniel had a dream and saw visions as he lay in his bed. He wrote down the dream, and this is what he saw. In my vision that night, I, Daniel, saw a great storm churning the surface of a great sea, with strong winds blowing from every direction. Then 4 huge beasts came up out of the water, each different from the others." Okay, so remember, prophecy is full of imagery. And here we read about a great storm churning the surface of this great sea. And so the question is, what is Daniel talking about? Well, again, the book of Daniel mirrors the book of Revelation. And Revelation chapter 7, verse 15 describes these waters as nations of the world. And the book of Isaiah, chapter 57, verse 20, kind of confirms this. It says that the wicked are like the troubled sea. And so this world, or the sea of humanity, is often pictured in the Bible as a churning, restless sea, which is actually a pretty perfect description when you think about it. When you think about, this world that we live in, when we consider the crime and the violence and the fraud and the abuse, the confusion over very basic things, the human trafficking, the drug addiction, pornography, you name it. Then consider how all of this will grow worse and worse near the end of time. 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1-5 says, it confirms that there will be terrible times in the last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good, treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, and having a form of godliness but denying its power. And so a churning, troubled sea is a pretty good description of what this world is going to be like. In fact, I think it's a pretty good description of what the world is like right now, don't you? In Luke chapter 21, verse 25, Jesus spoke of the last days, and he said that there would be distress of nations, with perplexity, the sea and waves roaring. Okay, so I think we've all heard that in the last days, people are going to be distressed. But notice that Jesus also uses this word perplexity, to describe the end of time. And so what does that mean? Well, perplexity is an interesting word that means an entangled state, or something that is so complicated that there seems to be no way out or no solution. In other words, this world will become such a complicated mess that people will start to look around and say, there's no way out of this. There is no solution to this. Well, just when everyone decides that the world situation is completely hopeless, a leader called the Antichrist will emerge from this troubled sea of humanity. He will ascend to power and begin to bring order. And at first, people will say, oh my goodness, he's wonderful because he seems to be the only leader who can unscramble this mess that we are all in. He's a miracle worker, a savior who brings, calm from chaos. And so the Antichrist will start out as, kind of this really great peacemaker, but that will be short-lived because really he is a deceiver and he is a killer, and in the end, he will bring war and destruction, like I said, unlike the world has ever seen before. Arnold Toynbee was a British historian who studied the decline of historic civilizations, and he died back in 1975, but not before saying something kind of prophetic himself. He said this: by forcing on mankind more and more lethal weapons, and at the same time making the whole world more and more interdependent economically, technology has brought mankind to such a degree of distress that we are ripe for deifying any new Caesar who might succeed in giving the world unity and peace. Now, again, I think it's interesting that Jesus used the word perplexity to describe the last days because that's what we see right now, right? Perplexity. Just when I was thinking that things could not get any more perplexing in this world, a few years ago, I started hearing about something called artificial intelligence. And experts like Elon Musk predict that AI will surpass human intelligence either this year or next. Isn't that crazy? Elon Musk also described AI as a destruction risk to civilization. He said that. And so when you add things like AI to the world soup of chaos, what we end up with is a whole lot of perplexity. And it will reach this tipping point when it looks like there's no way out, and that is when the Antichrist will come on the scene and he'll appear to have solutions. Now, back in Daniel chapter 2, do you remember that King Nebuchadnezzar had a vision one night? Do you remember that? He didn't know its meaning, and so Daniel came and interpreted his dream. Do you remember that Nebuchadnezzar saw a statue of a gold head, silver for arms and its chest, brass for the belly and thighs, legs of iron, and feet of iron and clay? There it is on the screen. Well, Daniel comes in and he says, what you're looking at here are the coming kingdoms that will rule over this world. He said, you, King Nebuchadnezzar, are the head of gold. Babylon is in power, but then your kingdom will fall. And that's when the next kingdom will take over, the Medo-Persian Empire. Then another kingdom will take over them, the Greeks, and then another world power will take over them, the Romans. And so all of these parts of the statue represent world empires that have already come and they have already gone. They are now history. But this last empire, which I think got cut off there, down at the bottom, the feet, that last empire is yet to be. And so this is a piece of prophecy that has not yet happened. And so the 10 toes of that statue represent a future coalition of 10 nations. And Revelation 17, verse 12 and 13 explains how the Antichrist at the end of time will lead a coalition of 10 nations. And so that statue was described back in Daniel chapter 2. Well, here in chapter 7, God gives to Daniel the same vision, but with a different analogy. God doesn't show Daniel a beautiful statue, but instead, he shows him 4 beasts that represent those same kingdoms. Daniel 7, verse 4 says that the first beast was like a lion with eagle's wings. As I watched, its wings were pulled off, and it was left standing with its 2 hind feet on the ground like a human being. And it was given a human mind. Okay, so this first beast seems to represent the Babylonian Empire. And I read, just this week that the national symbol for Babylon was a winged lion. Okay, so then the next verse, verse 5, says, "Then I saw a second beast, and it looked like a bear. It was rearing up on one side, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And I heard a voice saying, 'Get up, devour the flesh of many people.'" And so this second beast, a bear, represents the Medo-Persian Empire, which conquered the 3 great nations of Babylon, Lydia, and Egypt, which Bible scholars say are represented by those ribs in that bear's mouth. Verse 6 says, "Then the third of these strange beasts appeared, and it looked like a leopard. It had 4 birds' wings on its back, and it had 4 heads. Great authority was given to this beast." Now, this beast, a leopard, represents the Greek Empire, which was led by Alexander the Great. And the swift leopard is really the right animal to represent this empire because it conquered nations with great speed. Notice, too, that this verse says that this leopard had 4 heads. And that is also significant because history tells us that when Alexander the Great died, that his kingdom was divided among his 4 generals. Verse 7 says, "Then in my vision that night, I saw a 4th beast, terrifying, dreadful, and very strong. It devoured and crushed its victims with huge iron teeth and trampled their remains beneath its feet. It was different from any of the other beasts, and it had 10 horns." And so it is widely believed that this 4th kingdom represents the Roman Empire, which was cruel and materialistic and perverted. And what's interesting about this beast is that it has these 10 horns, just like Nebuchadnezzar's statue had 10 toes. And since there's never been a 10-nation Roman Empire, prophecy teachers say that this represents a future Roman-type empire. And again, the book of Revelation supports this idea. In Revelation 17, verse 12 and 13, it explains that the Antichrist will come at the end of time, and he will lead a coalition of 10 nations. Okay, so now we are coming to 2 verses in Daniel 7 that speak specifically about the Antichrist. Verse 8 says, "As I was looking at the horns, suddenly another small horn appeared among them. 3 of the first horns were torn out by the roots to make room for it. This little horn had eyes like human eyes and a mouth that was boasting arrogantly." Then verse 11 says, "I continued to watch because I could hear the little horn's boastful speech." And again, this is the Antichrist, and you might say that he was tooting his own horn. Okay. I try. The verse goes on to say, "I kept watching until the 4th beast was killed and its body was destroyed by fire." Okay, so I want to close this morning by giving more details about the coming Antichrist. And so here are 5 characteristics of the coming Antichrist. And the first is world domination. The first is world domination. The book of Revelation chapter 3 says that the dragon, or Satan, will give his power and his throne and his great authority to the Antichrist, who is described as a beast. Now, you might ask, How can Satan do that? How can Satan give a person that kind of power? Is he allowed to do that? Well, yes, he is. And here's why. God gave authority over the earth to Adam at one point. But then Adam and Eve fell. And Adam basically turned over to Satan that responsibility. It was delivered to Satan. And that's why in Luke chapter 4, when Satan tempted Jesus in the wilderness, he showed him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time, it says, and then said to Jesus in verse 6, I will give you the glory of these kingdoms and authority over them because they are mine to give to anyone I please. This is also why Jesus called the devil the ruler of this age, and why the Apostle Paul called Satan the god of this world. And so Satan will empower the Antichrist. And it's very clear that the Antichrist will conquer the entire world, at least for a time. And so, yes, it seems that the world is headed toward a one world government or a one ruler government. And we can sometimes even see the start of that now, with terms like open borders. What about globalization, multiculturalism, a global economy, a central World Bank, the United Nations? Okay, so for a brief time, the Antichrist will have world domination. And that's the first characteristic of the Antichrist. The second characteristic is just words. If you're taking notes, just write down words. Revelation 13:5 says, then the beast, or Antichrist, was allowed to speak great blasphemies against God. And he was given authority to do whatever he wanted for 42 months. And so for 3.5 years, which is the second half of the Great Tribulation, this Antichrist will run his evil, boastful mouth. He will be spitting venom against God all during that time. Again, we just read in Daniel 7 that the Antichrist will be full of boastful speech. But even more than that, the Antichrist will be a master of persuasion. Just last Wednesday at our Bible study, we talked about the power of words. And words are especially powerful in the mouth of a skilled politician. Think of Adolf Hitler, who convinced a nation to go to war and then to attempt to exterminate an entire people group. How did he do that? How did he do that? With just words, evil words, persuasive words, but really just words. And so if Hitler did all of that with words, imagine the persuasive power the Antichrist will have, because he will be empowered by Satan. And when the Antichrist comes on the scene, he's going to be likable and charismatic. He will know, just what to say to win people's trust and this mass appeal. He will be the greatest deceiver that the world has ever known. Okay, so a third characteristic of the Antichrist will be wonders. Wonders, as in signs and wonders. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 9 says that this man, or Antichrist, will come to do the work of Satan with counterfeit power and signs and miracles. And so, again, just imagine how persuasive the Antichrist will be, because not only will his words be persuasive, but so will his actions. He will appear to be this miracle worker. Bible scholar John Phillips described the Antichrist this way. He said, the Antichrist will be an attractive and charismatic figure, a genius, a demon-controlled, devil-taught charmer of men. He will have answers to the horrendous problems of mankind. He will be all things to all men, a political statesman, a social lion, a financial wizard, an intellectual giant, a religious deceiver, a masterful speaker, a gifted organizer. He will be Satan's masterpiece of deception and the world's false Messiah. A fourth characteristic of the Antichrist is worship. He will desire worship. And they say that wonder is really just one step away from worship. Look at Revelation 13, verse 4. It says, they worshiped the dragon, or Satan, for giving the beast such power. And they also worshiped the beast, Who is as great as the beast, they exclaimed. Who is able to fight against him? And by the way, maybe you have noticed that the world, our current world, seems to be ramping up for this level or this type of satanic worship. Isn't that true? You know, when I was a kid, I heard maybe, just a few times about someone who worshiped Satan. There's Satan worships out there, somewhere out there, they exist, but I didn't really know any. But now it seems like Satan has come out of the shadows with this steady rise of satanic groups and cults. Remember just a few years ago, Target seemed to have its own line of satanic clothing. Remember that? That's why I still won't go to Target. The Satanic Temple now claims to have 700,000 registered members. And the Satanic Temple even has a few after-school clubs in the U.S. That's a real thing. Those actually exist. If you don't believe me, you can look it up yourself. But there are actually satanic clubs that meet after school in some places. The Satanic Temple opened its own abortion clinic in New Mexico last year where an abortion religious ritual is performed during the procedure. That's real. The Bible teaches that Satan wants to kill and destroy, but he also wants converts. He desires worship, and he will have it, especially during that last half of the tribulation. Okay, so the fifth characteristic of the Antichrist is war. He will be a man of war. I've mentioned that he will rise to power by bringing calm from chaos, and he'll usher in peace, but then the Antichrist will bring war. Revelation 13 verse 7 says this about the Antichrist. It says, "And the beast was allowed to wage war against God's holy people and to conquer them. And he was given authority to rule over every tribe and people and language and nation." And so he is going to harass and kill believers. He is going to seize their property if they do not have the mark of the beast, which we'll talk about later. Now, some of you are bothered by what I just read in Revelation 13 because it says that the Antichrist is going to wage war against God's people. And what probably troubles you is you say, well, wait a minute, how could that be possible? I thought all the Christians were going to be raptured away. Well, I really believe that they will. But after the church is raptured away, the grace of God will remain. Meaning, after the rapture, people will still be able to surrender to Christ, and many, many, many people will do just that. And the ones who do will be targeted by the Antichrist because, again, anti means opposed to or against. And so if you are for Christ, the Antichrist is going to be very much against you. Now, lastly, I want to end with where I started today. And I started by saying that I would much rather talk about Christ than the Antichrist. And here's why. Because the Antichrist is called the man of sin, while Christ is called the sinless man. While the Antichrist is called an idol shepherd, Christ is called the good shepherd. While the Antichrist is called a beast, Christ is called the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. While the Antichrist will be the lawless one, Christ will be or is the Holy One. And lastly, while followers of the Antichrist will end up in hell, following Christ will lead you to heaven. And so the last point that I want to make this morning is this. Who will you serve? Who will you serve? Who will you surrender to? Who will you worship? And I think the choice is very, very clear. And I'll end by saying this. Do not wait. Do not wait to surrender to Jesus Christ. Don't wait. Let today be the day. Let's stand and we're going to pray. Father, as I was preaching, I was reminded of a saying of a popular prophecy program where they end with a slogan that says that things are not falling apart, they are falling into place. And I think sometimes when I read the Bible, it just feels like things are really falling into place now like never before. And so, Lord, help us to be aware, but yet not fearful. We know that you do not give us a spirit of fear or timidity, and so we are to be courageous people, and we're to encourage each other daily. And so I just pray, Father, that we would walk in a way that pleases you. I pray that thinking about the end times would really motivate us to share our faith and to live holy lives, because Jesus is coming, and we want to be ready. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.